in the gospel, into the first chapter of Matthew, and learning about your family. Learning about your family personally, it could be kind of exciting, but it can also be kind of dangerous. I mean, what if you don't like what you find? I mean, what if you discover? I mean, it would be exciting to discover that you're related to someone or famous or historic, but what if you discover that you're related to an infamous criminal or a serial killer? You know, we've said from the beginning of this series that when Matthew sat down to give us his account of the life of Jesus, he didn't begin with the story of baby Jesus in the manger. He begins with the family history of Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus, which is really an unusual way to begin any story, but Matthew's writing, the reason he did this is because Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, and he's trying to show them and prove to them that Jesus is related to Abraham, which made him a Jew, and that Jesus is in the lineage of King David, which makes him royalty. Because every Jew understood that the promised Messiah had to be a descendant of Abraham, and they had to be a descendant of David. So Matthew goes all the way back to Abraham, and he traces the lineage of Jesus from Abraham to King David, all the way to the birth of Jesus. And Matthew's genealogy is proof that Jesus is the promised Messiah, because he's related to all the right people. He's related to all the right people. But as we've already seen in this series, Matthew goes off script on several different occasions. Not only does Matthew mention all the right people, you know, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on, Matthew also mentions and even highlights some of the shady characters in Jesus' past. So Matthew goes out of his way, some people most of us would have just skipped over and hoped nobody else noticed. And as we saw last week, there are even a couple of people in Jesus' lineage that did some pretty awful things. Which begs the question, why would Matthew do that? Why would Matthew include people like that in the history and the family of Jesus? You know, people who had secrets, people who had a past, immoral people, and people who aren't even Jews are included in the family history of Jesus. And you and I would never include people like that unless they were the point of the story. In Matthew's account of the life of Jesus, imperfect people are not just part of the story of Jesus, they are the point of the story. Because Matthew is telling us what he understood, and he understood this better than anyone, because when Jesus called Matthew to follow him and become one of his disciples, Matthew was far from God. Matthew was a tax collector and a sinner, and Jesus didn't invite Matthew to follow him because of the good that Matthew had done in his life, but in spite of the bad that he had done in his life. And so now, years later, as Matthew is reflecting on that, and he's writing to a group of the most devoutly religious people in the world. I mean, he's writing to a group of people who lived by the letter of the law. He's writing to a group of people who made up rules to make sure that you didn't violate other rules, breaking the actual rules. He wrote to people who believed that a person standing with God is based on the good that they have done and the bad that they have not done. That's who he's writing to. People who believe that their personal righteousness and their careful observance of the law was their path to God. But Matthew was a tax collector and a sinner. And he understood that if that's his path to God, if that's his only path to God, that if personal righteousness and his ability to consistently live a good life, if that is his only path to God, Matthew understands he didn't have a chance. He didn't have a chance. So as Matthew's about to tell the greatest story that's ever been told, he needs to remind his readers what has always been true. What has always been true, that humanity has been invited by God to approach God on a relational level, and the foundation of that relationship is not on what they have or have not done. The foundation of that relationship is not based on what you do for God, but on what God has done for you through Jesus Christ. And that's what Matthew is trying to communicate. That he's trying to communicate this message, that our standing with God is not based on what we do for God, but on what God has done for us. Matthew understood that this was the very reason that God sent his son Jesus, is to save sinners. People who recognize their need to change, not the self-righteous people who believe that their right standing before God is based on their good deeds and their good behavior. That's not who Jesus came to save. Humanity has never been able to approach God based on what we've done. It's always been based on what God has done for us through Jesus Christ. So as Matthew traces the lineage of Jesus, he underscores and he highlights that, in fact, throughout all of history, God has graciously given his grace and his mercy to people who don't deserve it and people who cannot earn it. And that's the reason imperfect people are part of the story of Jesus, because imperfect people are the point of the story. That's who Jesus came for. And the point of the story is that Jesus came to save sinners. So in this genealogy, Matthew's reminding us again what's always been true, that throughout history, just look at it, throughout history, God has always chosen the unworthy. And God, from the very beginning, has chosen sinners and lawbreakers, because God is a God of grace and mercy and forgiveness. So this is how Matthew begins his story. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, talked about them last week. Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, talked about her last week. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, one of my favorite names in the Bible. Ram the father of Amminadab, not necessarily my favorite. Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the brother of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed the father of Jesse. Salmon the father of Boaz, let me get that full verse. Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. And Obed the father of Jesse. And Jesse the father of King David. So every Jew reading this would wonder, why in the world would Matthew include Rahab in this list? Because Rahab had a label. She had a label. And in the Bible, it wasn't uncommon for people to have a word that's associated with their name used to describe them. But unfortunately for Rahab, the word that was associated with her was the word harlot, which is the King James version of our word prostitute. That was her label. And everyone familiar with Jewish history would know her not as Rahab, but as Rahab the harlot, or Rahab the prostitute. Now, this creates some real tension in the story of Jesus, in the genealogy of Jesus, because not only is Rahab not only is she a harlot, not only is she a prostitute, but as we're about to discover, Rahab wasn't even a Jew. She was a member of a group of people known as Canaanites who were living in the land that God promised to Abraham and his descendants. And before God's chosen people could move into that promised land, then they had to move out the people who were living there, sometimes completely remove them, the Canaanites who were living there. And so there's some real problems here. But right here in the middle of the story of Jesus is the story of a Canaanite woman known as Rahab the harlot. Matthew could have just skipped over her, but he doesn't. Matthew includes Rahab to remind his original Jewish audience and to remind us that our standing with God is not based on what we have done, but on what God has done for us, his love and his grace and his mercy. So once again, here in the genealogy of Jesus, Matthew gives us another incredible story of grace, mercy, and forgiveness. We've seen it all through this series. And right here in the lineage of Jesus, Matthew includes a woman whose reputation is so tainted that she was given a label. And why would Matthew draw our attention to her? Because she's just not part of the story. Her story is the point of the story of Jesus. In the story leading up to Rahab, you may remember this, God's people leave Egypt. They're about to enter into the promised land. But before they do anything, Joshua sends a couple of spies to the city of Jericho to kind of spy out things and to kind of see what they're up against. Well, these two men sneak into Jericho, but they are seen going into a house that belongs to Rahab. Rahab immediately recognizes the men as Israelites, and she hides them. And the king finds out, and he sends these soldiers out to look for them. And when the soldiers ask Rahab about the spies, Rahab says, oh yeah, they were here, but they just left. And if you leave right now, you might be able to catch them. And that's what they do. And they leave. And then Rahab goes upstairs where they were hiding, and she has a conversation with the two spies. And this is what Rahab says. She says, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. I know the Lord has given you this land, and we just read that, and a great fear has fallen over you, but I wanted to highlight the word Lord there, because the word that Rahab uses to describe God is this translated Lord here is the most reverent name, the most revered name of God in the Hebrew language. And so the word was so highly esteemed that some of the Jewish leaders, or all of the Jewish leaders, and some of the Jewish people even, they wouldn't even speak this word that's translated Lord. It was the highest and most sacred name for God. And it's the name that Rahab chose to describe the God of the Israelites. See, Rahab believed that the God of Israel was the God over all gods, and that he had given them this land. That's her faith. And what Rahab is really saying is, in spite of everything that I've been taught, in spite of everything that I've been told, I believe that your God is the one God, only God, who reigns over everything. That's what Rahab is saying. And then Rahab tells the spies that everyone in the city is afraid of you, not because of you, but because of your God. So Rahab continues, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I've shown kindness to you. Give me some guarantee you will spare my brothers and sisters and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her, if you don't tell what we're doing. We will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So the spies, they leave Jericho. They report back to Joshua. Joshua leads the people across the Jordan River and into the promised land. But before they march out against Jericho, God gives them some very specific and rather unusual instructions. So Joshua meets with his military leaders and he tells them, just kind of paraphrasing here, he says, this is the plan that God has given me. This is the plan that God has given me. First, we're going to take all the men, all the soldiers, and on the first day, we're going to walk around the city walls. And then we're going to walk around one more time the second day, and we're going to do that all week. And then on the seventh day, we're going to walk around the city 7 times, and then we're going to shout. That's the plan, guys. Any questions? So, see, God's plan was to conquer Jericho in such a way that only God would get the credit. It wasn't by military might. This was God. So he does it in a way that only God gets the credit. And as a result, then, the people of God would know. The people of God would know, and all the people of the surrounding nations would know what Rahab knew, that there is no God like the God of Israel. So Joshua and his army do as they were told, and it works according to plan. They march around the city all week, and on the 7th day, they march around 7 times. And then when the priests blow the trumpets and the soldiers shout, the walls just collapse in on the city. And in the midst of all this chaos, only one family in Jericho is spared. Only one family, the family of a Canaanite prostitute. In chapter 6, we read this. Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. Isn't this interesting? God spares an outsider, an enemy, an immoral person, and he writes her into the story. Rahab the prostitute was accepted into the community of God's people. Now, eventually, if you know the rest of the story, eventually Rahab marries a man named Salmon. We read that. And they have a son named Boaz, and Boaz marries Ruth, and Ruth and Boaz have a grandson who is none other than King David. Here is Rahab, a woman condemned by the law for her occupation, a foreigner, an outsider, a woman with no platform of personal righteousness by which she could approach God. And there she is, right in the middle of the story of God. Matthew didn't have to include Rahab, but the story of Rahab prepares his readers for the story that he's about to tell, the story of Jesus. Rahab's story is really a reflection of the story that Matthew's about to tell, the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus came to save sinners. And even though she's guilty based on her lifestyle, and even though she's an outsider because of where she was born, not only does God spare Rahab's life and the lives of her family, he also writes her into the larger story of God. And surprisingly, if you fast forward to Hebrews chapter 11, surprisingly, Rahab is one of only 2 women, Hebrews chapter 11, that is given as an example of faith. Rahab the prostitute. At one time, she was known as Rahab the prostitute, but God gave her a new name and a new label, and it's Rahab the faithful. The story of Rahab is a reminder that your label is not an obstacle to God's grace. Rahab's label was not an obstacle to God, and neither is yours. God didn't care about Rahab's label. He cared about her heart. He didn't care about her past. He cared about her present and her future. God was not going to judge you according to your label. And your past sins don't have to be a barrier to keep you from God. And in some ways, then, Rahab's story is my story. And Rahab's story is your story, because each of us has a label. Each of us has a label. And your label may be known by many people. Or your label might be known by a few people. Or it might be a secret that you're hiding. But your label might even be why you have a hard time even coming to church. Your label might be why you're reluctant to engage in the mission of the church and in the mission of God in the world. But if your label is keeping you from doing what God is calling you to do, then I want you to consider this. Consider this about the story of Rahab. Why did the Israelite spies, who agreed to save the life of Rahab the prostitute, why didn't they say anything to her about her lifestyle? Why didn't they bring that up? I mean, why is there no conversation about her abandoning her trade as part of the deal? Why was changing her life not part of the agreement? All Rahab did was hide the spies and acknowledge that God is God. That was it. Her label was not an obstacle to God's grace. And the reality and the embarrassment and maybe even the shame of your label is not an obstacle for God's grace for you as well. It's not. You, like Rahab, are invited into a relationship with God just as you are, label and all. That's the way of grace. And that's the way it has been from the beginning. And that's what Matthew is showing us. Grace doesn't require people with these embarrassing or shameful labels, to shed those labels before ever coming to him. Grace doesn't require that. When you draw near to God, you don't receive condemnation. You receive grace. And God's grace is what empowers you then to shed those labels. God's grace is slow to judge, but it's quick to deliver. And when it comes to your labels, current or past, God is slow to judge and more than willing to deliver his grace. God doesn't withhold his grace until you clean yourself up or get your act together. Heart transformation is part of the process of receiving God's grace. In fact, God's grace not only empowers you to shed those labels, but God's grace provides you with a new set of labels. The old labels are gone, and the new label is forgiven. The new label is accepted, and the new label is loved. We don't know how long it took for Rahab to completely shake her past. I mean, old labels don't go away fast. They don't fade fast. And sometimes it takes a while even for the new ones to stick or take hold. But God's grace is always about giving us what we need and not what we deserve. Because we know that. And we know that the message of Christmas is this, that God has done for you what you could not do for yourself. We know what we deserve. What we deserve is death, and we know what we need. We need a Savior. Jesus Christ came to earth to save sinners like you and me. You cannot, by your own personal righteousness, save yourself. And that's why God sent his Son into the world to save sinners, and we're all sinners. No one is righteous. So even with your past and even with your labels, you're still invited into the story of God. You're still invited to follow Jesus Christ. God is inviting you into a relationship, not based on what you have done or haven't done, but in spite of what you've done and in spite of your label. God wants to invite you into a relationship based purely on what God has done for you. A relationship characterized by grace and mercy and love and forgiveness. And I know that sounds too good to be true, but it's absolutely the truth. And it's the point of the story. Jesus came to save sinners. Jesus came so that we might have forgiveness of sin. And Rahab's life reminds us of who we are and what we need. We are all sinners in need of a Savior. And there's only one person who can do anything about your sin, and that's Jesus Christ. And today, Jesus is inviting you into a relationship with him, into a relationship that begins by placing your faith in Jesus as God's Son and identifying your life with him through baptism. And Jesus is inviting you into that relationship, and it's God's desire for your life for you to do that, for you to be in relationship with him through Jesus Christ. And if that's your desire this morning, then we want you to know that we would love to help you, and we would love to encourage you in that. If you'd like to know more about how to have a relationship with God, if we can pray for you or with you this morning, we would love to do that. If you have questions, if there's somebody that you'd like to talk to, you just need somebody to talk to, we want you to know that we're here for you. So during the singing of this next song, the shepherds of this church are going to be down front, and they're going to be in the lobby, and they are here for you. Your label is not an obstacle to God's grace. Through Jesus, God is giving us what we need and not what we deserve. And that's the message of Christmas. And so if we can help you in any way this morning, won't you please let us know as we stand and sing.